July 18th, 1944. A sweltering morning in Biak, a small island off the coast of New Guinea. Private First Class Samuel K. Johnson of the U.S. Army's 41st Infantry Division wiped sweat from his brow as he advanced through the dense, stinking jungle. The air was thick with the twin scents of decaying vegetation and cordite. Weeks of brutal fighting had reduced the island's once lush landscape to a pockmarked hell, a testament to the ferocity with which the Japanese Imperial Army defended every last inch. Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa, had seen things in the past few months that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He'd seen comrades fall to banzai charges, watched as flamethrowers turned hidden bunkers into funeral pyres, and learned to distinguish the whistle of a Japanese knee mortar from the crack of a sniper's rifle. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he was about to discover. His squad had been ordered to clear out a particularly stubborn pocket of resistance, nestled deep within a series of caves. Intelligence reports, gleaned from captured Japanese documents, suggested this was likely a command post, perhaps even housing a high-ranking officer. As they approached the mouth of the largest cave, a faint, rhythmic sound reached them. Not the guttural shouts of Japanese soldiers, nor the rattle of machine guns, but a sound far more unsettling in this combat zone. Sobbing, human, unmistakable, and profoundly distressed. Johnson gripped his M1 Garand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every instinct screamed trap. Yet the sound persisted, a low collective lament. Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran of Guadalcanal, exchanged a wary glance with Johnson. "Fan out," Miller whispered, "and proceed with extreme caution." Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else, a cloying, sickly sweet odor that Johnson couldn't immediately place. The cave was dark, lit only by the beam of their flashlights, which cut through the gloom like surgical lasers. As their lights swept across the rough-hewn walls, they illuminated a scene that brought Johnson to a complete, shuddering halt. Not a command post, not a fighting position. This was a prison, a cage. Huddled in the dirt, their faces gaunt and bruised, their clothes ragged and stained, were dozens of women. Korean, mostly by the looks of them, and Japanese. Their eyes wide with terror stared back at the American soldiers. For a long, agonizing moment, neither side moved. The only sound was the drip of water from the cave ceiling, and in the ragged breathing of the exhausted soldiers. Then a young woman, no older than Johnson himself, let out a choked cry and scrambled backwards, pressing herself against the damp cave wall, as if trying to disappear into the rock itself. Others followed suit, their whimpers growing louder. This was not the reaction of civilians being liberated. This was the reaction of prey, cornered by predators. The irony was a bitter taste in Johnson's mouth. They were the liberators, the good guys, yet these women looked at them with a terror far deeper than anything he had witnessed on the battlefield. It was a terror born of experience, not assumption. Sergeant Miller, sensing the profound disorientation among his men, lowered his weapon slightly and spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man who had just cleared out a bunker with grenades. "It's okay," he said, his words clumsy and inadequate in the face of such suffering. "We're Americans. We're here to help you." The words, of course, meant nothing to these women, who understood no English. It would take days, and the arrival of an interpreter, to begin to unravel the horrific truth of what these women had endured. They were comfort women, forced into sexual servitude by the Imperial Japanese Army. They had been kidnapped from their homes in Korea, China, the Philippines, and even Japan itself, then transported to isolated garrisons like Biak, where they were forced to serve the sexual needs of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of soldiers. The euphemistic term comfort women was a grotesque cover for a system of systematic rape and sexual slavery on an industrial scale. The women in that cave on Biak had been living a nightmare, subjected to unimaginable brutality and humiliation. Their terror at the sight of the American soldiers was not born of animosity, but of a chillingly logical deduction. New soldiers meant new tormentors. The idea of liberation, of rescue, was so alien to their lived experience that it simply did not compute. The scale of the comfort women system was staggering, though meticulously hidden and denied by the Japanese government for decades after the war. Historians now estimate that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were forced into this system. Some estimates push the number even higher. These were not willing prostitutes, as Japanese officials would later claim, but kidnapped girls and women, often lured with false promises of factory work or nursing jobs, only to find themselves trapped in military brothels. The meticulous records kept by the Japanese army, often disguised as logistical reports, painted a horrifying picture of a system designed for efficiency and control. Rations, medical inspections, often cursory and brutal, and usage schedules were all documented. A woman might be forced to service dozens of soldiers a day, every day, until she collapsed from exhaustion or disease. The American soldiers, particularly those who had seen the worst of the Pacific War, thought they had encountered every conceivable horror. But this was different. This was not the clean, if brutal, violence of combat. This was a calculated, dehumanizing assault on the very essence of human dignity. For many of them, it was a turning point, a moment that shattered any remaining illusions about the chivalry of war. The discovery on Biak was not an isolated incident. As Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, similar comfort stations were uncovered on islands like Saipan, Okinawa, and in mainland Asia. Each discovery brought with it the same gut-wrenching realization. This was not a rogue act by a few depraved soldiers, but a systemic policy. The women liberated from these camps were often in dire physical and psychological states, malnourished, riddled with venereal diseases, and suffering from severe trauma. Many struggled to comprehend their newfound freedom. The shame associated with their experiences, often compounded by societal stigma in their home countries, meant that many remained silent for decades. Their stories, when they eventually emerged, were met with disbelief, denial, and even outright hostility, particularly from the Japanese government. The world, it seemed, was unwilling to confront this particular atrocity. The dramatic irony was palpable. These women had survived a war, survived unspeakable horrors, only to face a different kind of battle for recognition and justice. The cultural chasm between the Western understanding of war and the Japanese Imperial Army's ethos was vast. For the Americans, the concept of systematically enslaving women for sexual purposes was anathema, a violation of every moral code. For the Japanese military, it was a pragmatic solution to maintaining troop morale and preventing widespread rape of local populations, a twisted logic that saw the comfort women as a necessary evil to protect other women. The casual brutality, the bureaucratic efficiency applied to such human suffering spoke volumes about a dehumanization that ran deeper than mere wartime exigency. The average Japanese soldier, indoctrinated into a culture of absolute obedience and sacrifice, saw these women not as individuals, but as commodities. Consider the contrast. While Allied forces were providing medical care, food, and attempting to repatriate these women, the official Japanese stance was to erase their existence from history. The sheer audacity of the denial, maintained for so long in the face of overwhelming evidence, stands as one of the most profound historical ironies of the 20th century. The stories that eventually did emerge, through the courageous testimony of survivors in the late 1980s and 1990s, slowly chipped away at this wall of silence. Women like Kim Hak-sun, a Korean survivor, broke decades of silence, enduring public scrutiny and shame to demand recognition and apology. Her bravery, and the bravery of countless others, finally forced the world to listen. The physical liberation of these women was only the first step in a much longer, far more arduous journey. The wounds, both seen and unseen, would never truly heal. Many lived out their lives in quiet desperation, haunted by memories, unable to form lasting relationships, and burdened by a societal stigma that unfairly blamed them for their own victimization. Their stories are a stark reminder that the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the deepest corners of human experience, scarring generations. The initial terror in their eyes, that day in Biak, slowly gave way to a hesitant hope, a fragile belief that perhaps, just perhaps, these new soldiers were truly different. It was a hope born not of ideology, but of desperate human need. The legacy of the comfort women system continues to cast a long shadow over Japan's relationship with its neighbors, particularly South Korea. Despite numerous apologies and gestures of reconciliation, the issue remains a raw nerve, a symbol of unresolved historical injustices. The denial, the revisionism, the attempts to downplay the severity of the atrocities all serve to perpetuate the suffering of the survivors and their descendants. The discovery by Private First Class Johnson and his squad on that remote island in 1944 was more than just the uncovering of a single military brothel. It was a revelation of a systemic horror, a glimpse into the darker side of imperial ambition, and a testament to the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and, ultimately, resilience. The liberation of those women was a small, quiet act of humanity amidst the overwhelming destruction of global war, a momentary inversion of expectations, a tragic irony finally giving way to a glimmer of hope. The war in the Pacific, particularly the island-hopping campaigns, was characterized by an almost fanatical Japanese resistance. Every cave, every ridge, every patch of jungle was defended to the last man. This brutal reality often meant that American forces, accustomed to surrender on other fronts, were confronted with an enemy willing to commit mass suicide rather than be captured. This doctrine of gyokusai, or shattering like a jewel, meant that the Japanese High Command had little regard for the lives of their own soldiers, let alone the lives of those they had enslaved. This ideological framework, which prioritized imperial glory and unquestioning loyalty over individual human life, created an environment where atrocities like the comfort women system could not only exist but thrive without internal dissent. American intelligence, piecing together fragmented documents and prisoner interrogations, began to grasp the sheer scale of the logistical operation required to maintain the comfort women system. It wasn't a haphazard collection of opportunistic acts. It was a centrally organized, efficiently managed enterprise. Women were cataloged, transported, and assigned to specific units. Supply lines already strained by the demands of war made provisions for these comfort stations, not just food and medical supplies, but also payment in military scrip, which was often worthless to the women. The sheer bureaucratic effort involved in orchestrating such widespread human trafficking was a chilling testament to the Japanese military's commitment to the system. Back on Biak, the immediate aftermath of the discovery was chaotic. The interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier named Kenji Tanaka, struggled to bridge the immense cultural and emotional gap. The women, traumatized and distrustful, often broke down in tears or lashed out in fear. Tanaka, fluent in Japanese and Korean, found himself navigating a linguistic minefield, trying to explain that these American soldiers were truly there to help, not to inflict further harm. He relayed stories of their homes, their families, and the unspeakable indignities they had suffered. One woman, her voice barely a whisper, described being dragged from her village in Korea at knife point, separated from her younger sister, and then transported for weeks in the hold of a cargo ship, fed only meager rations and subjected to constant abuse. Her story was not unique. It was a pattern repeated across thousands of lives. The medical condition of the liberated women was appalling. Many suffered from chronic malnutrition, dysentery, and advanced stages of sexually transmitted diseases. The medical examinations they had received in the comfort stations were often brutal and designed to ensure they could continue to work rather than to genuinely treat their ailments. American medics, accustomed to treating battlefield wounds, found themselves confronted with injuries and illnesses that spoke of prolonged systemic abuse. They worked tirelessly, but the damage, particularly the psychological damage, ran deep. For many of the women, the simplest act of kindness, a warm blanket or a decent meal, was met with suspicion, a reflex born of years of cruelty. The American command, faced with dozens of traumatized women, wrestled with how to proceed. Repatriation was complicated by the ongoing war and the sheer logistical challenges of transporting so many individuals across vast distances. Furthermore, the stigma associated with being a comfort woman meant that many feared returning home, knowing they might face ostracization rather than sympathy. Some expressed a desperate desire to simply disappear, to shed their past identities and start anew in a place where no one knew their story. This profound sense of shame, internalized due to societal expectations and the insidious propaganda that sometimes blamed the victims, was yet another layer of their suffering. The testimony collected from the survivors, translated and documented by Tanaka and other intelligence officers, painted an increasingly detailed and horrifying picture of the system. It was not just sexual slavery, it was often accompanied by physical torture, starvation, and constant psychological degradation. Women who resisted were beaten, denied food, or subjected to even greater horrors as a warning to others. The system was designed to break their will, to strip them of their humanity, and to reduce them to mere instruments for the gratification of soldiers. The cold, clinical language of the intelligence report stood in stark contrast to the raw, emotional accounts of the women, creating a disturbing juxtaposition of bureaucratic documentation and individual suffering. In the ensuing decades, as the world moved on from World War II, the issue of comfort women largely remained buried. The Cold War shifted geopolitical priorities, and the desire for a strong, democratic Japan as an ally often meant that uncomfortable historical truths were glossed over. The Japanese government, in its official capacity, maintained a position of denial or minimal acknowledgement, often framing the women as voluntary prostitutes. This narrative, stubbornly clung to for so long, infuriated survivors and their advocates, who saw it as a continuation of the initial injustice. The persistent denial created an ongoing wound, preventing genuine reconciliation and healing. However, the efforts of activists and the courage of individual survivors, often referred to as halmoni, Korean for grandmothers, slowly began to pierce the veil of silence. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the first public testimonies emerged. These were not easy revelations. Many women had lived in silence for over 40 years, carrying their shame and trauma in isolation. To speak out required immense courage, knowing they would face not only public scrutiny, but also the painful re-experiencing of their past. Their voices, though often frail with age, carried an undeniable power, forcing a global re-evaluation of this aspect of wartime history. One notable example was Jan Ruff O'Hearn, a Dutch-Australian survivor who had been interned in a Japanese camp in Indonesia. Her testimony in the mid-1990s, though distinct from the majority of Korean and Chinese comfort women, added an important international dimension to the debate, making it harder for the Japanese government to dismiss the issue as solely an Asian problem. Her dignified yet devastating account brought the issue to a wider Western audience and underscored the universality of such wartime atrocities. The Wednesday demonstrations in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, which began in 1992, became a powerful symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice. Every Wednesday, regardless of weather, comfort women survivors, often frail and elderly, would gather with activists, students, and supporters to demand an official apology and legal compensation from the Japanese government. These protests, which have continued for decades, represent an unprecedented act of sustained moral pressure, a testament to the enduring strength and resilience of the survivors. The international community, slowly but surely, began to recognize the gravity of the comfort women issue. Various human rights organizations, legal scholars, and even some UN bodies issued reports condemning the practice and urging Japan to take full responsibility. Resolutions were passed by legislative bodies in countries like the United States, Canada, and the Netherlands, calling for Japan to acknowledge its wartime atrocities more comprehensively and offer sincere apologies and reparations. The weight of international opinion began to mount, making outright denial increasingly untenable. Yet despite these developments, a complete and satisfactory resolution remains elusive. The Japanese government has issued a number of apologies over the years, notably the Kono Statement in 1993 and the Murayama Statement in 1995, which acknowledged the military's involvement and expressed remorse. However, these apologies have often been seen by survivors and their advocates as insufficient, lacking full legal accountability, or subsequently undermined by remarks from conservative politicians who deny or downplay the historical facts. The specific demand for legal compensation, rather than humanitarian gestures, has been a consistent sticking point. The underlying theme here is the overwhelming power of documentation versus mythology. For decades, the myth perpetuated by the Japanese government was that these women were willing prostitutes, or that the military had no direct involvement. But the meticulous records, the personal testimonies, and the physical evidence, like the cave on Biak, gradually dismantled that mythology. The numbers, cold and devastating, tell a story that transcends individual denial. Hundreds of thousands of women, across multiple nationalities, subjected to a centrally organized system of sexual slavery. It is a statistical horror that cannot be wished away. The ironic juxtaposition continues to this day. Japan, a modern democratic nation, a global economic powerhouse, struggles with a past that its victims refuse to let it forget. The very technology and industrial might that allowed Imperial Japan to wage its devastating war in the Pacific also created the logistical capacity for the comfort women system. This capacity, intended for military efficiency, was perversely applied to human exploitation. The contrast between Japan's forward-looking, innovative present and its deeply troubling, unaddressed past creates a profound cognitive dissonance, both within Japan and in its international relations. Private First Class Johnson, having returned from Biak and the Pacific, eventually went home to Iowa. He rarely spoke of the war, and certainly never spoke of the women in the cave. Like many veterans, he buried his experiences deep within, but the image of their terrified faces, the stench of that cave, and the dawning realization of what he had witnessed would forever be etched into his memory. He had gone to war to fight an enemy, but he had found a different kind of horror, one that challenged his understanding of human nature and the true cost of imperial ambition. The survivors of the comfort women system, the Halmoni, are now a dwindling number. Their advanced age means that time is running out for them to receive the full justice they seek. Their fight is not just for themselves, but for future generations, to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated and that history is accurately remembered. Their legacy is a stark reminder that true liberation is not merely physical. It is also the liberation of truth, the freedom from denial, and the eventual triumph of memory over deliberate historical amnesia. The initial terror in that cave on Biak, the terror of women confronting what they believed to be a new wave of tormentors, ultimately transformed into a defiant demand for recognition, a demand that echoes across the decades, refusing to be silenced. It is a dramatic and tragic irony that freedom from one form of oppression led directly to a decades-long fight for freedom from historical erasure.